Hello, and greetings from Sydney. I'm not going to lie to you, this was meant to be greetings from Sydney Mines. And I drove all the way out there, and not only had I forgotten my microphone, but when I was taking establishing shots, it was so cold that my phone froze. And I needed to come back home and restart. Honesty is the best policy. My name is Ian, as ever, and today we're talking about Paul Moose MacKinnon and an alternative Cape Breton. This is one of my own writings. This was for an anthology of about Canadian comics. It was called The Canadian Alternative, and it was about the use of underground comics in Canada and the development of it. It's an understudied area of comic scholarship. There's been bits and pieces like studies of Seth, for example, the guy who did the Louis Riel book. But for the most part, it's underutilized, which is a shame because Canada has some great graphic artists. This was my humble contribution, but that might explain some of the repetition that you might have read in it. It needs to give for a primarily an American audience. It's needing to give a certain amount of context about Cape Breton and a certain amount of historical background and particularly of industrial Cape Breton and some folklore stuff, so that for a non-folklore audience this might be new to them, and but you know it has its merits, and so that might explain why as you're reading it, you're like, I already kind of know this sort of stuff. Always be mindful of audience. So yeah, the purpose behind this came about when Paul MacKinnon, who's known since he was in high school as Moose, deposited his collection at the archives of the Beaton Institute. And Jane Arnold, the archivist, brought it to my attention because I didn't really know about this because I'm not from here, but I knew about the CBLA, or the Cape Breton Liberation Army, as an idea. I knew about it from such things as the work of General John Cabot Trail, because even as a kid, I'd heard his stuff on the radio. He had taken this idea and turned it into a bit of a stage persona. And, he and Paul Moose were friends and had sort of this crossover growing up. And but I didn't know about the comics, and I didn't know about the calendars, and so and I also didn't know that I actually knew personally some of the people involved. General Peyton of the CBLA, it was and is the husband of a friend of mine, a colleague at the university. And so when Jane showed it to me, you know who that is? That's Peyton, right? And I was like, no, it's not. That's remarkable. So. What I was interested in is, I've tended to be interested, since coming to Cape Breton, in terms of these things that are unexpressed. These ideas that are clearly, as far as a folklorist is concerned, speaking to the informal culture that rises up between the more formal structures, interstitial culture, as it were, that is found to be meaningful, that's found to be profound and important, and yet is often understudied through the perspective of people who are seriously seeking out the capital T traditional. And so I've done stuff on the Sydney River Trestle, and I've done stuff on Dishpan Parade, which was a series of, which was a radio show in the mid-1950s. And now I did the Old Trout Funny stuff. But the idea was that starting in the 1970s. In the 1970s, you basically had these two overlapping moments. You had what would have basically been the first generation of baby boomers, for all that suggests. People who were born post-war, after the after the economic uncertainties of the 20s and 30s and 40s, born to either a returning generation or a generation that was now sort of being promised the benefits of the economic recovery that happened in the post-war years. The ascendancy of sort of this North American culture, for good or ill. But, capitalism has triumphed, democracy has triumphed, and we're beginning to see this, the 1950s and 1960s culture of, and more than anything, mediated by radio and television and film and distribution networks like record shops and comic book stores and all these things. So Cape Breton, and highways and the roads and the Canso Causeway and all of these things were taking the island that was Cape Breton, that was always connected to other places. Let's not romanticize it. That was always part of a larger North American culture, but really bringing it home to these children and adolescents in the 50s and 1960s. And just as much, it is not a matter of rejecting Cape Breton concepts or Cape Breton identity. It's a matter of doing a both and. It's a matter of not trying to divide between what is the authentic Cape Breton self that is defined solely by that which has gone before, but more than anything, trying to discover what it is to be also a citizen of North America. So participating in that. But at the same time, you had this generation that was therefore going to be reaping all these promises, including such things as university education. You had Xavier Junior College had started in the 1950s or 1960s, basically as a extension campus of St. Francis Xavier, right in the downtown of Sydney, and it was a hub. You spend 2 years here, then you go finish your degree at St. FX, and it was a hub of like a university town should be. It was a college town in potency, and so you had the beginning of a kind of bohemianism that was in a bit of stark I don't know, again, dichotomize too much, but in a bit of a stark contrast to the industrial nature of Sydney that had gone before, and of the region. You also had this community that was slowly getting tied together, not necessarily as pixelated as here is Sydney, here's Sydney Mines, here is North Sydney. People were slowly becoming more integrated in these isolated communities, isolated only in as much as they had their own municipal governance, they had their own school boards, they had their own laws, for that matter, and they were and they had their own centers of governance, and they had their own infrastructure that allowed for people to spend much of their daily lives in these towns, as opposed to contemporary CBRM, where many of the people who are in the what are now sort of satellite communities need to travel and move around CBRM. So it's a much more kind of municipal, metropolitan center. And this was just the beginnings of it. So you had this bohemian culture, the beginnings of a kind of counterculture. And they were listening to the late 60s, early 70s music. And they were reading the late 60s, early 70s comic books. And they were watching the late 60s, early 70s movies and late 60s, early 70s television. And they were just at that cusp of being hippies, as it were. So as we're as this group starts to coalesce just at about the same time as the economy collapses. So this would have been the generation that was going to sort of participate in that middle class ascendancy. The kids of the baby boomers, no, not the kids of the greatest generation, to use these terms, who were now of adult age and were going to sort of set forth and do the great things. St. FX in 72, 74, UCC or CCB began when they started offering their own degree program, the VAX program, and so you had the beginnings. You had the doubling down of this desire to educate the local population, not have to go off island for it. But you also had the collapse, or the threat of collapse of steel. You had the beginnings of the threat of collapse of coal as well. So, I mean, at one point you had the economic certainty of, well, these were industries because this was a boom town. Then you also had that economic certainty of I don't have to work in the mines, or I don't have to work in the mill, because that's what my parents' generation did. And what I'll be able to do is I'll be able to have this sort of middle class ascendancy, and I'll be able to live here, because what gives that middle class ascendancy a possibility is the economic stability of coal and steel. And then you had that go. So all of a sudden you had this sort of promise of middle classness, of that sort of the leisure that artistic or life of leisure or life of social justice or whatever might have promised, and then fundamentally taken away when starting in 1967, when it was hinted at that the steel plant was going to close. It was actually proclaimed that the steel plant was going to close, and it was government rescue that came in and stopped that by taking it over, by nationalizing steel and coal, and finding a way through things like ECBC and DevCo and all those acronyms of winding down the economy in a way that wouldn't actually traumatize the population. You can make an argument that happened nonetheless. So early 1970s, and it wasn't unique to Cape Breton. Everywhere was going through this. The early 1970s were not a particularly fertile time. It was sort of obviously America was going through the end of the Vietnam War and the disillusion that was bringing. You had beginnings of the oil crisis and economic collapse that way. You just had so many. It was a fairly dire time, and it was also a dire time in as much as you had the beginning of paramilitary uprising organizations like the PLO, like the Symbionese Liberation Army, and so forth, which actually gave birth to the joke idea of the Cape Breton Liberation Army. You had this kind of laughable context of the answer to Cape Breton's prayers would be independence. And it was laughable in as much as people were laughing at it. Because if you didn't have the economic stability, how are you locally? And you're fundamentally going to be dependent on being part of a province and being part of the nation. It's arguable whether the liberation was ever about independence entirely or just severing from Nova Scotia. It was mainly predicated on hostility towards decision-making taking place in Halifax. The argument that sort of gave rise to this fancy. But you had these cynical, well-educated, they didn't always follow through with their education. Peyton didn't. Paul Moose eventually did. He went back to become a nurse. But these artistic, bohemian, too cool for school types who were kind of laughing at the idea of liberation and independence and the notion of terrorism as a way of doing it. So the CBLA was formed, and it was their entire objective was basically the liberation of beer trucks. The CBLA was not formed. The CBLA was the jokey name that this group of friends gave each other, calling each other generals and so on. When Paul decided to go to PEI, to Holland College, and to go into graphic arts, he decided that his project was going to be a comic book, because he had written comic books before. He had written comic books. He always aspired to be a comic book artist, and he had a notebook that was his circulated among his friends, where basically the drug-fueled adventures of this group of friends in Cape Breton. What would it be like if alternative comics took place here? And then he decided to do it as his project, and he sold one, and then he did 2 more issues. He started on a 4th. A couple of years later, he even started on a 5th, but those didn't come into fruition. And I think he realized that his life as a commercial artist probably wasn't going to happen in late 1970s Cape Breton. He went back and became a nurse, but he produced these series of calendars. But the stories themselves, we want to speak to this idea of, first, it plays on Cape Breton stereotypes. It plays deliberately on reflective stereotyping of the Cape Bretoner as only really interested in being on the pogey, as spending most of their time in pursuit of women, in pursuit of alcohol, and playing pool and darts and so on, and listening to East Coast blues music, going to Minglewood shows. So, and it's inherently reflective. This group of individuals he was with, the members of the army, they were all active in their communities. They did social justice work, they were doing startups, some of them were photographers, some of them were poets, some of them were ethnographers. Many of them went into traditional industries like fishing and so on. They were working as hard as Cape Bretoners always work, but as they defined themselves by their play, and their play was very much in keeping with this notion of Cape Bretoners, that joke culture, that idea of how they would present themselves when they are when they wish to the way that they self-perceive in a way that gives them a sense of distinction, that plays not simply on the stereotypes, but plays on the stereotypes that they know that others have about them. And what is more so, that plays with stereotypes that they wouldn't necessarily want other people projecting upon them. They're happy to inhabit quite nicely. So the army became this sort of fixture of Cape Breton culture through Paul's ongoing creation of these calendars, the CBLA calendars, wall poster-sized calendars that you would sell at Christmas, and they became part of the interior landscape of many people's houses. And so there's some wonderful illustrations of the calendar, being a functioning calendar and lives being written upon them, but they would be a feature in, say, the kitchen of the home. And over time, the calendars sometimes became a bit more somber, in part because they started to do things like commemorate friends of his, or not family members, but friends of his, acquaintances of his, musicians, for example, who have died in the intervening years. Because he's moving from a kid in his mid-20s to, by the time his last calendar was 2000. It was a Y2K calendar. And by the time he was done that, well, he'd 51, and some people had died, and Cape Breton had, the mill had completely disappeared at this point. It had been erased from the landscape. The environmental impact of things like the Sydney tar ponds was being realized. You had, the most, if not all, of the mines had closed. You had a real economic dependence, and what's more, you had this shift to the celebration of Cape Breton culture as a commodity. One of his last calendars was about the Macs, and it was this sort of this celebration of all things Gaelic and fiddly and guitar and acoustic guitar driven. And how they had sort of come to define the Cape Breton music scene. And he was basically sort of looking at Minglewood and looking at the East Coast blues, which really had defined the music scene. And it's like, what has happened to this? And there's a poignancy to it. What has happened to the East Coast culture when this is what is being projected instead? So the article, I don't know if it speaks for itself. It is difficult to synopsize, but it's a good way of parsing all these issues that we have when we talk about any particular culture, and especially a culture that, or a region where culture is a identifiable source of economic power and an identifiable source of identity work, when other forms of identity work, like occupation, seem to be sliding by, and economic surety seem to be sliding past. So this notion of alternative, and quite frankly, I was also trying to weave the word alternative into the into the title in order to sort of justify the inclusion in this collection, but then it got me thinking about Cape Breton always understanding itself as distinct. If we think of alternative as something that defines itself almost by definition as something distinct from the mainstream, now you're thinking about mainland Nova Scotia as the mainstream. Now you're thinking of Canadian culture writ large as the mainstream. It's like there is something, and the notion of alternative that seems to suggest, yes, not as viable, but realer, truer, more authentic. And it's just something to consider, especially that tension that comes up between the presentation of culture, that public image, as Richard MacKinnon talks about. Everyone's called MacKinnon, so forgive me if I get confusing. The public image that Richard MacKinnon talks about versus that sort of private reality. The culture that is lived versus the culture that is lived when other people are watching. And that's kind of some of the things to consider when you're reading this. It is very cold. I'm going to stop. The sun was almost going down when I started, and now it is even more down. And I'm probably confusing the good people of King's Road. So, as ever, I wish you well. We've been talking about Ian Brodie. I hear he's very good. And his article, Paul Moose, MacKinnon, and an Alternative Cape Breton. As ever, my friends, stay warm, be well, take care. Bye-bye.